In the rest of this section of lecture, I want to turn to talking more specifically about the immediate aftermath of independence and then the period that followed from 1870 through to around about the Great Depression. Big point to make about the immediate aftermath of independence was very significant institutional and social instability with frequent changes of government, civil wars, a major instability. And the other main feature of this period is that we observe relatively low rates of economic growth. There's historical analysis that talks about which way does the causality run. If you have a view of the world that emphasises the importance of institutions, then you might argue that it was the institutional and social instability that prevented economic development really occurring during this period. There are other approaches which emphasise the failure to develop economically as a reason why there was so much institutional and social instability. That if in some way, for example, Latin America had been able to tie into the the growth coming from the Industrial Revolution during this period, then that might have engendered greater institutional stability. As a perspective on the institutional stability that did exist, this is a graph that shows the number of new constitutions for different sub-periods from 1820 through to the present, from 1810 through to the present, for the 8 major Madison Latin American economies. And you can see that really if you take out Venezuela, which has had significant constitutional instability in the period from 1870 onwards, you can really see the point about the extent of political instability that there was in the period before 1870, with almost 30 changes of constitutions across the 8 countries in these sub-periods before 1870. But then if we take out Venezuela, only 7 in the period from 1870 to 1930, and then only about 12 or 13 in the period from 1930 to 2010, which of course is a much larger period than those other sub-periods. So an overall perspective on the period and the immediate aftermath of independence is major political and social instability being associated with relatively low rates of economic growth. But then, for a period of 50 or 60 years after around about 1870, we see stronger economic growth in Latin America. In fact, if you remember back to the first part of this lecture, rates of economic growth in Latin America that are comparable to the strongest growing parts of the world during this period. And what happens during this period is that Latin America really ties into the Industrial Revolution and the first era of globalization. And this becomes the basis for creating staple economies in Latin America. Economies that essentially have as the major or a major economic activity producing raw materials which can be shipped to Europe to fit in with the creation of an international pattern of specialisation or division of labour, where Europe is increasingly specialising in industrial production, in manufacturing activity, and as a result, the opportunities arising for other parts of the world to become the suppliers to Europe of raw materials which are going to be an input to the Industrial Revolution, whether it's feeding providing food inputs that are going to feed the manufacturing industrial workforce in Europe, or whether it's supplying mineral products that are going to be inputs to the industrial production that's occurring. So with the improvements in transport that occur, the improvements in shipping in particular, later in this period from 1870 to 1930, a development that's particularly important for Argentina is the development of refrigeration, which turns Argentina into a major supplier of refrigerated meat to Europe. So those technological developments in transport that enable easier contact between different regions, and the increasing pattern of specialisation in production as the Industrial Revolution proceeds in Europe really provides the basis for relatively rapid economic growth in lots of parts of Latin America as they become suppliers of raw materials to the Western economies. There were three types of integration into the world economy, which describe in a table in a minute, but essentially there was supply of tropical staple food products. There was the supply of more temperate climate food products or raw materials such as wool, and there was the supply of mineral products. So different countries, different regions in Latin America tied into supplying raw materials to the Western world, North America, Western Europe, in different ways. Importantly, at this time, policy was in the right direction. So we've talked a lot in this section of the lecture about the institutional settings in Latin America and the idea that there's always been a bias in Latin America towards elitist political institutions. Well, in this period, it having an elite controlling policy making generally means that they're going to set policies that benefit the areas in which Latin America has a comparative advantage in production. So, for example, in Argentina, we have oligarchic political system where essentially it's the elite landowning classes who are in control, and they direct policy to benefit economic production in economic activities where land is the intensive factor. So, for example, in wool production, in grain production, eventually in production of in cattle raising as well. So the elite are engaged in the economic activities in which Latin America has a comparative advantage, and so they set policy in a direction that actually favours the activities in which Latin America has a comparative advantage. So there's a confluence of external and internal forces, an increase in demand for what Latin America can or has a comparative advantage in producing. And that's not stymied in any way by policy making. So we see relatively strong economic growth. Here's a perspective on the areas of comparative advantage of Madison's main 8 Latin American economies, and you get a sense of the 3 zones that I talked about. For example, Argentina, which has the temperate climate zone, it is producing primarily maize and wheat. So over 40% of of Argentina's exports at the time are in those 2 commodities. You've got Brazil, which is a tropical zone country, where basically about 80% of its exports are in the tropical crops of coffee and rubber. And you've got Mexico, which would be an example of the 3rd type of region, where the main raw material export is mineral commodities. And so Mexico, about 40% of its exports are made up from silver and copper. So 2 points here. One point is if you look at what's being exported, you really get the point that this is raw materials that are being exported to the West. It's raw, it's food products like maize and wheat, it's the input products like silver and copper, or it's the food products like coffee that are being exported. So it's really raw materials that are going. And secondly, by looking across the different countries in different regions, you get a sense of the idea that there were 3 ways in which Latin America was integrating into the Western world at this time. Here's a graph that shows for Latin America as a whole and for the 8 major economies the growth in exports as a percentage of GDP from 1850 to 1912. So if we look at Latin America as a whole, in 1850, 10% exports constitute 10% of GDP, but by 1912, 25%. So a very large increase in the degree of engagement of Latin America with, in particular, Western economies at this time. Who benefited from this? Well, the benefit was relatively widespread. So remember, and this is a point I made when I showed this graph before in the first section of the lecture on Latin America, remember the period at the end of the 19th century, early 20th century is the period when the United States is really the fastest growing economy in the world. That's when it's becoming the world's industrial leader. And so when we benchmark against the United States in this period, the late 19th, early 20th century, we're benchmarking against a country that it's difficult to match. Yet we see that Chile, Brazil to some extent, Argentina definitely, in the last part of the period Mexico, they're all holding their own against the United States during this period. So generally across the Latin American countries, the scope to export to Europe means that they perform relatively strongly. Of course, there is some heterogeneity, and so Argentina was the country, the economy, which was able to tie in particularly strongly to the Western economies. Huge immigrant flows to Argentina, huge flows of capital from Europe, for example, from Britain to Argentina, and a large demand for the food products that Argentina was able to supply. So some countries do better than others, but in general this is a period of relatively strong economic growth across the major Latin American economies. In the next section of the lecture, I'll move on to talk about what came after this period of relatively successful economic growth, where countries in Latin America were really utilising their comparative advantage to grow relatively rapidly.